lots of ways, the cannabis industry owes a significant debt, not just to the like, oh, all these people were put in jail in the past, but realistically, it's because there's been a growing concern about the inequities of the drug war that I think you have marginal folks more willing to vote, whether it's an initiative or whether it's a legislative vote. You know, I see we did bad before and it's been racially unjust. And so I want to do better, right? That's helping to push the policy agenda. And I'll go even further and say, and because of prohibition, the price that quote unquote consumers have paid for cannabis has been inflated, obviously, because you got to deal with the illegality and all the inefficiencies that illegality creates. And that's itself why you now have a customer base that's actually willing to pay as much as they're willing to pay in the legal market because they've historically overpaid for what is essentially a weed.
Welcome to episode 32 of People Are the Answer. I truly believe that people are the only answer to the world's many problems. I'm Jeffrey M. Zucker, a serial entrepreneur, here to learn how innovators are creating outsized, transformational social impact. Today's episode features Douglas Berman, Newton D. Baker and Hostetler Chair in Law at The Ohio State University. He is also Executive Director of the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, which aims to enrich public conversations about the intersecting fields of criminal justice and drug policy and enforcement. He is also an expert on sentencing law and a major advocate for criminal justice reform. Doug and I discuss his career journey, the human elements of our criminal justice system, the mess of the war on drugs, and much more. Here is Doug Berman on People Are the Answer. Doug, thanks so much for joining me on People Are the Answer.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Always great to speak with you. Excited to share some things with the listeners here.
Me too. Glad to be here.
So let's start off with just telling the listeners, who you are, where you're based, what your current role is.
Sure. My name is Douglas Berman. I am a professor of law at the Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law. I've actually been here. I'm rounding out my 25th year, which seems hard for me to believe, but yeah, I've been a law professor a pretty long time. But I was a practicing lawyer before starting here at Ohio State, and before that, had a chance to clerk on a few courts. I think maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I've been a law professor a very long time now.
Awesome. Well, experience goes a long way. So, in general, what would you say motivates you?
I think it's the excitement that, as an academic, to do what we often talk about as sort of the three stools of our job. One is the teaching, and it's always so exciting. Each new semester comes along. Teaching classes sometimes that I've taught a lot of times before, sometimes newer classes on cutting edge subjects, and there's always that excitement, and you're always motivated to take your knowledge and convey it to students and engage with them. And law students are, it's a graduate degree, and so they're pretty sophisticated when they come in, and to be able to kind of introduce them to new ideas, again, to think about things in new ways, that's always very motivating and very exciting. Then we have the research, the scholarship piece, which is a huge part of kind of our outside the classroom activities. Thinking about the work of courts, thinking of the work of other institutions, writing articles of all sorts, and that's always really exciting. Can be a little more solitary, but that can often be something exciting as well, to have that sort of time to think hard and research in a rigorous way about the topics that we're working on. But then I also, it sometimes gets forgotten, but very much a part of what law professors do, what I think all faculty try to do, is also have a service element where we're maybe it's serving the law school community outside the classroom. That's pretty common, but also can be serving the broader community. And that's been a part of some of the work that I've done through my center. And in other ways, I also run a blog where I get a lot of interactions with practicing lawyers, judges, all sorts of public officials. And that piece is also just really motivating, because it can be sometimes on very hot topics. And so you're keeping up with the news and you're kind of trying to address those matters, but they can also be longer service projects where you're kind of deeply invested in trying to not just advance the law with your ideas, but actually doing the work.
Yeah. So it certainly sounds like there's plenty to motivate there. And one thing that you stuck with me from what you were saying was that despite being in the job so long, you get all these new students coming in, and it's exciting every time. And there's some jobs people do for 40 years, and I'm like, how can you do that every day? But it makes sense to me. You get to see these new people, you get to watch them grow, and really see the impact that they either are going to make or start to make in the world.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's thrilling. I've now got a pretty big alumni base, and I'll have a chance. I had drinks with an alum that actually works in the cannabis industry just yesterday, and I can
Nice.
still remember recruiting him to come to the law school here, having him as a student, and then seeing his practice develop is really exciting. But also the younger alum and helping them try to sort of get started in a career, and obviously a whole bunch of different legal industries have moved up and down over the time that I've been here, and so it really is refreshing. I will say it's challenging because I like to think of myself as relatively hip, and I'll do these pop culture references and I have them in my notes, and then I'll make a pop culture reference that was just killed 10 years ago, and the students are just like, what is he talking about? This old man is like making a reference to Seinfeld. What's that? And so in another way it's refreshing because it's like, okay, what's the latest hottest thing? Can I keep up
Keeps you
with
on
that?
top
And
of it.
yeah, and very much so. I think it's a part of the responsibilities of my job. If I can't sort of convert and convey the ideas effectively, using things that are familiar to my current students, then I'm not doing my job as well as I could.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And uh, where did you grow up, and what was it like there?
Yeah, I grew up in the DC area, or for folks who know, I like to think of myself as a child of I-95 because my mom and stepdad lived in Columbia, Maryland, which is where I spent most of my time. But my dad and stepmom lived in Tacoma Park, and so that's kind of closer to DC. The other is closer to Baltimore. Especially, I ended up going to high school at a little private school called the Park School up in the Baltimore area, and so when I got my license at age 16, I did a lot of driving up and down that I-95 corridor, and that's what felt like home to me for many years. And then I migrated up to New Jersey. I was very fortunate to go to Princeton for my undergraduate degree, and then I went straight through and went to law school up in Boston at Harvard. And so, kept moving up the I-95 corridor all that time, and that's again what's sort of so interesting now, having been here in Columbus, Ohio for 25 years. I didn't get off that I-95 corridor until I came out here to Ohio. The first time I stepped foot in Ohio, in fact, was to interview for the job out here, and so I still think of myself as an East Coast boy, and even though my wife Chris and
Yeah.
I ended up having two daughters here in Ohio, they're both kind of migrating back to the East Coast. So maybe that East Coast blood is still in us. But I think I still think of myself as a Maryland kid through and through, and every time I go back there, I'm always happy, and especially the Maryland Eastern Shore where I spent a lot of summers. Really, still feels like home in a special kind of way.
Yeah, I can certainly relate growing up in Charleston, South Carolina on the East Coast, and going to school in Boston. I haven't been on the coast since college, but it's certainly always part of my identity that I'm an East Coaster.
Yeah, yeah. It feels familiar in a certain kind of way that nothing else can when you go back home. So
Exactly. Um, awesome. Well, it's certainly a great place to grow up. You mentioned you went to Princeton for undergrad. Was that a good experience? What are your takeaways?
yeah, it was a very good place for me. It was interesting. I mentioned I went to this little private high school in Baltimore. I think we're 54 people in my graduating class, and so had a very intimate schooling experience in high school, which sort of served me well at that time. And then when I got up to Princeton, it was like this big place. It seemed huge, even though relative to a place like Ohio State, Princeton's a fairly small student population and campus. But I just was so excited to have the range of opportunities that came with that, to meet all sorts of people, from all around the country. Realized, how privileged I was to have that opportunity. Very fortunate that I got a wonderful girlfriend my freshman year who was literally living in the same entranceway. That's kind of how the Princeton dorms work out. There's these Gothic buildings where there's an entranceway, and that's who you meet, even among other floors, whoever goes through that entranceway. And I was on the first floor, she was on the second floor. We dated all through college. She's now my wife of 20 some odd years as well. And so, that was a huge part of my Princeton experience because, like I said, we dated all through those years and really got to know each other and each other's families, and both got so much out of the experience, both as not just the dating part, but I think we both really enjoyed university, the opportunities that we had there. And so I recommend it highly. And in fact,
Yeah.
my youngest daughter is a rising senior there. And so we were very blessed to also have one of our daughters go there. Although our older daughter loved the idea of Boston, so she's a BC grad. I know you're a BU
Ooh,
guy, and so
yeah.
I won't lean into that one too much in this context. But it's yeah, I think an
I,
aspect of their affinity for the East Coast is, because both Chris and I went to Princeton, we'd go back to reunions, we'd have this, incredible just joy on our faces in kind of returning to college environments. They were both kind of very interested in the idea of going to a campus-based school. Ohio State,
right.
it's such a big campus. You definitely can have a campus experience, but most kids end up living off campus, and it's not quite urban, but it's got a more city feel, kind of relative
Yep.
to some other places. And so, that was, and BU obviously has that kind of same dynamic, I
Yep.
know. And so what I think we liked about Princeton was this: it was a bubble, but a bubble that you could get out of, go to New York, go to Philly and do other things, but also, everybody who was in the Princeton community were there with the university, and that was really
Yep.
special.
So you said you went straight into law school. Did you like always know you wanted to be a lawyer? What drew you to that?
That's a wonderful question. My grandfather on my mother's side, so my mother's father, had been a lawyer and a pretty prominent lawyer in New York City. Had a bunch of contacts. Was very kind of steeped in being a lawyer, and that always sort of appealed to me. Interestingly, my father also had become a lawyer, but then left it. It wasn't for him, and he went on to actually become a middle school teacher. And so he was actually like, you sure it's for you? You shouldn't do it if you're not sure. My family kind of talked me into it, and it didn't work for me. And so, are you sure? Are you sure? And I think him, in some sense, saying this wasn't, wasn't a difficult child in this way, but I think him saying like, you got to be really sure, made me like, yeah, I think I'm sure. Yeah, yeah, no, this is the right thing for me. I think it's right. And I actually, took a few undergraduate courses that were, kind of in the pre-law sort of spirit, and really like those. Felt like, yeah, the kind of thinking here suits me. I also got the wonderful opportunity while an undergraduate. It was actually my first summer between my freshman and sophomore year to intern with a federal judge who had actually been a colleague and friend of my grandfather's. And while I was there, I got to do not quite the same work as a clerk, but got to sort of see what it was like behind chambers and the way in which kind of legal decisions were being made by the judge. And the judge was very complimentary, like, "Oh, you get this stuff, Doug. You could be a lawyer. You kind of pick this up faster than some of my law clerks." I'm like, well, that sounds good. If a judge is telling me I'm good at this, I guess this is something I should think seriously about doing. And so, and again, this is where I really am grateful for the privileges that I had, to have that kind of connection, to get that kind of experience, to then, be able to feel confident that this could be a path for me, really suited me. And then I'll be very candid. I took the LSAT and did well, and I'm like, I guess I am good at this. And so let me see where this can take me. And obviously getting into to Harvard Law and having a chance to go there, just really was another part of it. And I was very fortunate to really like that environment, and was really kind of struck. And I really think my own professional personality started to emerge in that era, where lots of people who I couldn't quite understand why they were so grumpy. It just seemed like everybody at Harvard Law was grumpy about something, and I'm like, We're at Harvard Law, and we're in our 20s, and this is Cambridge is really cool. And
It's a
why
great
is everybody?"
attitude. It is, right?
And I just was so struck by, like, I just don't get why all these people are so grumpy, when it seemed to me, at least, we were all very privileged. And I think I may have had more privilege than most, but still, that kind of led me into kind of a philosophy about the work that I do, that trying to sort of find that space where we can be less grumpy, a little bit more optimistic, a little bit more hopeful, has really driven a lot of the work that I do in a variety of kinds of ways.
Well, I love that attitude and that perspective on life in general. And it's awesome that you had that at that time with you and continue to express it in your work.
Thanks, thanks. Yeah, no, it's. I remember seeing a movie. I can't remember what movie this was, but where like one of the characters was like, we just we just don't give enough credit to people who are just kind of pleasant most of the time. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. We don't give enough credit to those people because that's a rarer attribute than it should be, and it really is nice to have those kind of people around. And I've sort of taken that to heart at times.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. Um, and so, after law school, you became a judicial law clerk. I'd love to hear some about that experience.
Oh, it's just an absolutely wonderful opportunity. I recommend to my students. I recommend to anybody, even if they're just thinking about going to law school, to be thinking about positioning themselves to have a chance to be a clerk to a judge. And I think to any judge anywhere is a great experience because it's seeing behind the scenes at the work of the judiciary, how judicial judicial decisions get made, and then particularly, I always describe clerking this way: as a clerk, you get all the excitement of that without any of the real burdens. Like the judge makes the decision; it's not your decision. You just get to make a recommendation, and you do the research, and you think about it, and maybe you can come up with a new way to look at a problem that will really influence the judge. But at the end of the day, the judge is the judge, and the judge will decide, and so you just get to have the fun of trying to piece it out and help him or her make the best possible decision. And I had the extra great fortune of clerking for just two amazing jurists. First, John O. Newman, who at that time was the chief judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. And he had actually been a district judge for many years. And among the things that made working for him so wonderful was he, as an appellate judge, brought a kind of trial judge perspective. And he was often really good at telling us clerks who were always like super eager to like decide everything. Oh, this little case is about 10,000 things that we see in it. And he's like, well, no, it's about one thing. We decide that one thing, and the other 999 things we'll figure out some other time because that's what we do as courts is just decide the case in front of us, and we say what needs to be said. And he was interested in a lot of issues in really important ways, including the federal sentencing system, which I got a real exposure to through that first clerkship, and so I can talk a little bit about that a little bit more. But it was a particularly great to have that experience with a judge that had been a trial judge and then moved on to Guido Calabresi, who had just started on the bench, same court, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, but he had just come from being dean of the Yale Law School. And he came at judging with a much more kind of, I might say, academic bent. And among the things that was funny is he would see not just 10,000, but 100,000 things in every case. And us clerks, he had the incredible wisdom to hire a bunch of experienced clerks. That's one of the reasons I got the job, because I had already been clerking for Judge Newman, and then the following year did for Judge Calabresi. And us clerks were like, no, Judge, you're going to be a judge a long time. You don't have to write every single issue into every opinion. We trust us. You're going to have plenty more cases to talk about all these things that you're so excited to talk about because you had been, looking at these issues as an academic, for many decades, and seeing sort of both of those perspectives. Both judges kind of had somewhat similar judicial philosophies, but I really got to see how their histories kind of shaped how they did the job of judging. And that's, again, a big part of why clerkships are so exciting, because you learn how much nuance and depth there is to judicial craftsmanship that goes beyond just, is it a conservative judge or a liberal judge, or are they an originalist or a textualist or a living constitution? Those labels are so simplified, and there's so much to the work of deciding cases that go beyond, kind of the trite summaries. And then the last thing I'll sort of emphasize just about how much clerking was an incredible experience for me, but also shaped my career in so many ways. I was absolutely stunned to discover how much of the work of the federal courts were what I would consider two-bit drug cases. And it was just time and time and time and time again. And I actually knew I was interested in criminal law issues. And so when the new cases would come in, the clerks would divide it up, and the other clerks would be like, here's all the kind of silly criminal drug cases again, which aren't that interesting because of the same issue over and over again. I'd always be like, sounds good to me. That looks interesting to me, even though there was a kind of monotony to the kinds of issues that would come up. But it kind of really fortified my sense that the drug war, as experienced in the federal system, is experienced in our entire country, dare I say it in sort of simplistic terms, was just a big waste of time, right? That we just were fighting this fight.
And it ruined a lot of lives.
Oh, absolutely.
Continues to ruin lives.
So much so. And the one that, I don't know if this was exactly the moment at which I got radicalized, but I remember so distinctly. It was my very first case, my very first week clerking for Judge Newman, the first of my clerkships. It involved a young woman who came into JFK Airport, right, that in New York City airports, and was being met by her boyfriend, who it was her understanding was involved in a drug trade. She knew she was bringing drugs to meet him, but was doing it as part of her relationship with this guy. She wasn't an active member, it seemed, of the trade at all. She gets into the parking lot where this boyfriend's meeting her. She hands over the briefcase that she had been bringing with us, and as soon as she does that, she gets arrested. Turns out the boyfriend had become a cooperating witness and was helping law enforcement find out other people who were involved in the drug trade. But she gets arrested. The briefcase had already been, uh, through law enforcement's involvement, styled to have enough drugs in there to make her subject to a 10-year mandatory minimum. So she was carrying
Oh,
1.0015 kilograms, I believe it was heroin. And she didn't even know what she was carrying, right? She knew she was carrying drugs, and technically that made her criminally liable. But the issue in the case, and actually a brave, famous jurist, Judge Jack Weinstein, had said because she didn't know how much drugs were involved, I don't think she should be subject to this 10-year mandatory minimum. And that made perfect sense to me.
yeah.
Unfortunately, the law said it doesn't matter. As long as she knew she carried drugs, she's fully liable, even though it was a sting that had set this up to make her subject to this 10-year mandatory minimum. And of course, the real backstory was they didn't care whether she got 5 or 10 years. What they wanted is for her to be under the most pressure to be willing to then report
Wow.
who she was working with and who else was a part of this network of operations, because that's how they get leverage to get cooperating witnesses. And the more severe the punishment, the more pressure they can put on. She didn't know. She just could tell the people that the law enforcement already knew about. So they didn't give her any credit. And she was subject to a 10-year mandatory minimum. And I remember, explaining to Judge Newman, I think the law is we have to, affirm that she gets 10 years, but this really stinks. And he's like, yeah, it does stink. And he
Yeah.
worked to encourage me to draft a concurring opinion where we essentially said, this stinks. And,
Yeah.
I was
It's
pleased to
not
have
the
a
first
chance
time
to
I've
do
heard
that.
of that around
Yes,
mandatory minimums that happening. I mean,
absolutely.
this is a prime example of how they aren't fair and can ruin lives, and how these judges are prepared to have this like to have this ability to decide what they feel is right, and it's so nuanced based on the situation. It's certainly a major issue with our system.
Absolutely. And it was, both to work on that case and get a deeper understanding of these sets of issues. And then that led to me through a variety of sequences to write an article about drug sentencing in the Second Circuit. And that article got published by the Federal Sentencing Reporter. And that got me started in a relationship with the people behind the Federal Sentencing Reporter that ultimately led me to become an editor of the Federal Sentencing Reporter. And now I'm the managing editor with another fellow of that journal. And, it's, again, there's so many of these moments where I just professionally remember, gosh, if I knew where this would take me, I would maybe even reflect on it more than I do now. But that first case, still has purchase for me, because I know it just I was why didn't I learn about this in law school? Why isn't this an injustice that we're talking about more? This was the early 90s, and so we're kind of really at the height of the drug war then, just got off of Reagan and Bush the father and Clinton, sort of leaning into let's get tough and tougher on all sorts of drug offenses. And it was just so valuable for me to sort of see what that really meant to individuals.
Yeah, you kind of saw under the hood of what was really going on, and so many of the politicians, they're just seeing the policies written out. They're not actually seeing it happen in daily life to actual humans. It's that's powerful, and I mean, I'm glad that you came upon that and you realized that, because it's obviously led to some important work.
Yeah, thank you. No, and under the hood is a great way to describe it, because that's exactly right. Is that it just you don't see where this takes you and how it operates, you just can't get the full effect of it. And I'm sure you've had experiences like this too, where I'll meet people who just kind of know the superficial, and they're like, I don't see what the big problem is, and then maybe they get a family member involved, or they hear about a case where it becomes personal, and then all of a sudden they're like,
Yep.
how do they let people get away with this? It's like, yeah, we've been telling you about that for a while.
It's a shame, honestly. It's with too many issues that's the case. When it hits home in some way or another, that's when people really get on board, and it's hard to blame them. Like, that makes sense, but there's so many people fighting over these injustices, and the fact that it takes that for people to see it, it's like, you know, we I don't know how political we're getting, but if it's like, obviously we've got gun control issues right now, but I see it every day in my cannabis policy work. And I've mentioned this on the podcast before. I'll go to speak with a legislator about cannabis policy one year, and they'll be staunchly opposed. The next year, their sister-in-law, used medical cannabis for cancer while she was going through cancer treatment, and then they're fully on board. And it's like,
Yep. Yep.
a lot of these issues that, and especially ones I feel like I care about, are about human rights.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people need to have the compassion for other humans. Obviously you have the most compassion for your loved ones, but just trying to put yourself in these shoes, I think, is so important. And
Absolutely.
like
And
you said,
it's
we've had privilege, right?
yeah.
And so we have the responsibility, in my opinion, to help the people that don't.
Right. And I think you said it nicely too, because I think you have to always recognize we all have limited bandwidth, right? So it's like, there's lots of folks on lots of issues who want us to, kind of be able to drill down and fully understand. And that's where I try to stay open minded, is that if somebody else is really passionate or focused on another issue, maybe it is because I haven't had a direct experience, and I need to at least listen to them about, what this means to them on their terms. And I'm particularly excited there's an effort, and I think it's ongoing, and different folks are pushing it on the criminal justice side to get legislators and other public officials to just visit prisons, right? Just to sort of see the
Yeah.
humanity that's there. And I think it's been particularly interesting, again, not to get too political early on, but uh, in the wake of the January 6th riots and the prosecutions there, we're hearing from a lot of folks on the right, like, look how terrible, they're being treated and being held in jail prior to charges. And it's they don't have access to their lawyers or computers or anything that they can connect with their family. I'm like, yeah, this is what we've been saying for a long time, is what the criminal justice system does to human beings. And as much as you want to get frustrated in saying, you're only paying attention when it's the human beings you care about, you I want to again encourage people to then like leverage that moment and say, okay, don't you see, this is the story of when it affects a community that you're close to, that you have an understanding for, you're necessarily going to see this as an injustice. And if you can see that across a range of issues and a range of people, that can get us to a better place. And so
Yeah.
but yeah, it's hard because of it's there's everybody's got the things they know about and understand, and we don't want to be depressed all the time as well too,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah, no, that's very true, and certainly I want to dig in more on some of those topics. But to bring us there, how did you end up at Ohio State? I know you said you hadn't been there until you interviewed.
yeah, so I knew I was interested in becoming an academic, and even more than having family members who had been lawyers, I had a lot of family members who had been teachers, and that seemed something that suited me in a variety of ways. And again, I
And
mentioned
you
the
did
sort of
spend some time in private practice. I'll add, I left that
I
out.
did. Well, I was gonna sort of loop that in. So
Okay, okay.
after a couple years clerking, I actually looked at whether I could get into the academy right away. That didn't seem uh, like an easy path, and especially people were telling me having a couple years of practice experience would serve you well, in the classroom and in thinking through kind of what kind of professor you wanted to be, and what the work was like. And I had the good fortune as a law student to spend summers working at a large law firm in New York City, Paul Weiss Rifkin, Wharton and Garrison, and had really good experiences there. It was a firm that really sold itself on and lived up to its commitment to pro bono work. Had a particularly large litigation department. That's what folks who may or may not know kind of the way law firms function. Most of the money gets made through corporate, especially larger law firms, corporate clients, and often that's transactional work, mergers and acquisitions or other kinds of business relationships. And I tried that out as a summer associate, and I couldn't make sense of that at all, or at least not in a way that fit me professionally. But the litigation side of things really did. And so I ended up joining the litigation department for Paul Weiss for a couple of years after clerking, and really was very fortunate to have a very rich docket. When I tell war stories to students, and that was, 25 years later, I'm still telling war stories from 2 years in the firm. But fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, at times, you work really, really hard in those firms. I tell my students, for basically 2 years running, I didn't have dinner with my wife on a weekday night and on lots of weekend nights as well, because I was just working really, really hard. I'll sometimes say I got 10 years of experience in 2 years, which was great, but especially great was some of this really interesting, clients I was fortunate to have while I was there. We had a cosmetics company as one of the clients, and I was very involved in a patent dispute over lipstick. And so I often will tell my students that I kept the world safe for lipstick as a lawyer, and I both do that as a joke and as kind of a reminder that um, you go to a corporate law firm, you do the work the clients that can pay you want you to do, and that isn't always the most awe-inspiring work, but they're paying you to approach the issues as if they're the most important issues in the world, because that's what they need a lawyer to represent them to do. And in the context of these cosmetic cases, it meant I was often going into drugstores all around Manhattan and going straight to the lipstick counters and looking at the different formulas of the different lipsticks. And I would get all of these weird looks, justifiably so, as I'm like looking at lipsticks, and it's just like, who's the strange stalker dude who's like, and I'm like, oh no, I'm working on a case. And so I'm doing an investigation. And yeah, after a few times of that, my wife especially got annoyed at me. She wouldn't even accompany me as I was creeping my way around the lipstick. And so that was sort of a really interesting a client that I had in that period. I also had the good fortune, this was the pro bono work, or really the misfortune, of getting on a team that was representing a client on death row in Texas. And among the things that makes me sad, although I always want to kind of tell the story, is there was no dispute that he suffered from what we now call intellectual disability. Back then, we used the term mental retardation. And the law at the time didn't make that a categorical exclusion for being executed. And
Wow.
I had a sense the law would get there. You could sort of see at that time the kind of jurisprudence starting to emerge, and especially the members of the Supreme Court at that time. I had a feeling if we could keep this client alive long enough, we might get to the point where there would be litigation that would save his life. Um, and he would still be subject to incarceration, but not be executed by the state of Texas. And unfortunately, we weren't able to. Right, we made the strong arguments, but this is 1997. It wasn't until 2001, 4 years later, that the Supreme Court, in a case called Atkins, said categorically, if you were suffering from intellectual disability, you shouldn't be executed, and cruel and unusual punishment protects you. And I remember I felt very fortunate at this big law firm. This was not a paying client. We were doing this all pro bono, but they gave all the same resources. We were able to write all the same briefs, make all the same arguments as powerfully as we possibly could. But we just couldn't get to the finish line. And among the things that I especially remember at the time was George W. Bush, the son, was the governor of Texas at that time, and we wrote a particularly impassioned clemency petition, and we were able to actually get the husband of the victim to say he didn't care if the guy got executed at all. He didn't say he was against the execution, but we felt like it was a big win to be able to at least have him on record saying, it's not going to change my life. It doesn't matter to me, and we thought, oh, maybe this, can be a factor that could make a difference. And yet, I think in part because at that time Bush was already thinking about when he was going to run for president, and again, 90s still a time number of executions were ramping up, and we were in that sort of the core tough on crime mode, and Terry Washington was executed in 97. And among the things that then we learned later was Bush's chief counsel at the time was Alberto Gonzales, and apparently Gonzales didn't even take our petition to Governor Bush. He just said, "Oh, it's another one of these death cases. There's nothing special about this one. There's no reason to even think about that." And so, you find that stuff out, and you just, obviously it scars you because I'm talking about
Yeah.
it, you know, 25 years later. But you know, that was where um, the law firm experience was so meaningful, because it wasn't just I got to work on, you know, interesting paying matters, but they also supported
Yeah.
doing this other kind of work, and I got to see, you know, another version of where um, there's both an opportunity and kind of an obligation to take advantage of having those resources, right? And
Yeah.
I do think we litigated this, you know, really well, and I do think we helped lay the foundation. There was another case called Penry, raised similar kinds of issues that Paul Weiss also was very actively involved in, and got that to the Supreme Court a couple times. That really was the set of cases that got the jurisprudence moving forward. And as a result, it's sad to realize this, but we had estimates that between 10 and 20% of the death row population is intellectually disabled, because there's all sorts
Jeez.
of the deficits are the type that um, this is some of the, that's amazing. I still remember all of these materials we had put together, but that often persons who suffer from intellectual disability will try to cover, and part of their covering is played into by law enforcement effectively, even when
Mm.
somebody's innocent, or, you know, they were in a fight. Oh, well, you wouldn't have done this if it was a fight. You're not smart enough to sort of figure out how to kill somebody, are you? No, I am smart enough to kill somebody. And, you know, you just get these,
Right.
you know, sort of strange encounters that ultimately, again, you know, in a punitive criminal justice system, can always
Yeah.
turn
I
against
mean,
a defendant. And so that was, you know, it was a very meaningful time, you know, doing that
yeah.
litigation, getting that work, and getting that experience. And it allowed me to feel confident when I then went on the teaching market, you know, at the end of that I had something to offer to my students.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like tremendous experience. It's, sad that it ended up the way it did, but unfortunately not surprising. Another example of when people are just looking at the paper versus the human, with Alberto Gonzalez in that case. And it also, I think lately in society, people have become a little bit more aware of how people with intellectual disabilities are treated within the system. Even if it's just like from a Netflix crime show
Right.
where it's like a reality, doc, and they're showing you footage of these discussions or these interrogations, and how just absolutely incredibly unfair and coerced so many things are. So, again, another one of those times where you got to see firsthand what was happening, and you didn't like it, and
Yep.
can't
Yeah.
blame you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's particularly interesting because I remember it was right at the time when I'd gone on the teaching market, and I can talk about that a little bit more as well, and got the Ohio State job, that I was like, all right, I'm going to go teach a sentencing class, because I had been doing this work on the federal sentencing reporter, and, you know, working on drug cases and other things. And I'm going to be that rare law professor that I'm not even going to talk about the death penalty, because there's so many other issues that are so
Hmm.
important that don't have to do with the death penalty. And the death penalty kind of sucks up all the air in the conversation. And you know, there's a bunch of classes taught on the death penalty, but there's nothing taught on other parts of the sentencing system. And I had this all sort of chip on my shoulder that was how I was going to make my difference. And then I worked on this death penalty case for kind of the last 5 months of my time at Paul Weiss, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is why everybody wants to talk about the death penalty, because it brings into this sort of just sad, rich relief the range of issues. That's not just, you know, the sadness of a person with disabilities being subject to the unfairness of the system, but I particularly remember, this is, you know, it sticks with me. One of the associates I was working with was due to get married at around the time that an execution date was going to be set. And she just literally called the prosecutor and said, "Hey, I'm getting married." And the prosecutor's like, "All right, we'll do that a month later." And basically, our client lived an extra month because she was getting married. And the prosecutor's like, "Yeah, whatever, you know, what's a month, you know?" And again, you kind of come to understand that in the functioning of somebody whose job it is to have all these appeals, and he's got, you know, 100 people on death row, and they're all just cogs. They're not thinking about the humanity of each one. That was just being a courtesy to another lawyer. But again, 25 years later, I'm talking about remembering the fact, oh,
Yeah.
you know, his execution date was May 97 instead of April 97, because she was getting married. I'm like, well, maybe I should say I'm having a baby or something, you know, whatever
Yeah.
it takes to put this beyond, you know, the timeline that would serve us. But of course, you know, limits to what we can
Well,
do responsibly, you know, as lawyers and representatives. But it's, you know, there's just so much humanity, and then also so much, you might call it just sort of rote administration that goes
yeah.
into the way our criminal justice system functions. And again, I there's
I mean, I love the points that we're making. At least, it's unfortunate that these things happen, but they're still so pertinent, unfortunately, to our current system and to the lack of equality within it. And that there are these people on death row that aren't getting looked at as human beings, where there's people in another position that are
yeah.
getting favors done
Right, right,
because
exactly. Yeah, yeah, it's dark. Yeah, in so many ways. And so, but then around that time, and I mentioned, the how did I get to Ohio State? If you're interested in being a law professor, you need to go wherever the job is. And there's 200 law schools, which sounds like a lot, but it's not, especially because this is in some sense the greatest job in the world, and so lots of people want it, and lots of people are interested in applying for it. And so there's a big book of that's put together by the Association of American Law Schools, ALS. And it used to be a book, and now it's an electronic file where you would just have to put your entire resume on a single page. And on that single page, law school hiring committees could look through who's there. And part of that process is often, just what's the school needing to hire for, the different subject areas. Oh, we, need somebody who teaches in property law. Okay, let's see who's interested in property law. We need somebody who teaches in criminal law. Okay, let's look what's there. That's where I was selling myself. Although I actually, because I had practice experience with intellectual property issues, I also said that I could teach in that space. And so I was fortunate to get a fair number of interviews, and had a chance to interview on campus out in California and New York and here in Ohio. And this place just seemed to sort of suit me particularly because they were very keen to have me teach a sentencing course, and by that point I had decided I was going to do both non-capital and capital sentencing. And I thought it was very exciting to be offered that opportunity. Uh, Hopefully people can't remember back then, but back then nobody was really talking about sentencing. Nobody was talking about mass incarceration. That wasn't even a term yet. There wasn't even
wow,
kind of the deep understanding of just how big and oppressive our criminal justice system was becoming. And that was something that I had become aware of in a lot of the ways that we've discussed already. And so I knew I wanted to teach a class kind of in that space, and around those sets of issues. And generally you think, oh, I'm going to be a junior professor, I got to do kind of whatever they need me to do for 5 years, 10 years, and then I'll get a chance to do my specialty course, or the unique things that I'm driven to focus on. And Ohio State was saying, no, no, you'll get to do that your first year. And then I remember thinking at the time, like, oh gosh, I better mean I get to do that. If they're really going to have me teach a sentencing course, I'm going to have to invent a sentencing course. And realistically, there were no case books in the field that were up to date. There was really no core materials. What would a sentencing course look like? And so I was very fortunate that they set it up so that my first semester I taught a traditional first year criminal law course, and so that had kind of not quite off the shelf, but I could develop my materials pretty readily from existing case books. And then in the spring of my first year, I developed the sentencing course for the first time, and that was just so thrilling, both to kind of have my own baby, and again, it's another one of those moments that played a central formative part of my career, because after developing my own materials, I reached out to some colleagues and said, I think there should be a casebook here, because I want to teach out of a casebook, not just put together, we call them Xeroxes back then, but now it would be a digital file for my students. And ultimately got into contract to create the sentencing law and policy casebook, and we're now in our fifth edition. And so
it's great.
it's been going strong, and it all goes back to, I even still have around me as part of the clutter is the loose bound papers that I made students get from the copy machine, the copy center, when I first taught that sentencing course. And now I teach it from the fifth edition of my casebook.
It, it's really cool to see how that has evolved, and I just think it's important to like take into account the fact that I'm sure you probably know the number. There's tons of classes using this casebook now, so I mean, you basically started that and got this into so many lawyers, right? Like, I think that's exciting.
It very, very exciting. It's got so many moments I can reflect back on of how great it is, and then the sort of weird, frustrating moments that's still part of what's so great. So having students not only take the class, but then go out and practice, and come back and say, yeah, it seemed like my whole practice was sentencing, not all that other stuff I learned in all those other classes. I'm like, yeah, I know. That's why I thought it's so important to teach a class like that. Now I think there's four, maybe five other sentencing texts, and so not authored by us, but by other
Right.
academics. And again, to me, that's
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 great.
it shows that the field has grown, the need has grown. It's also a part of what our culture has. I think more generally, I've been pleasantly surprised. I think both my daughters, as undergraduates, took mass incarceration courses because I think we've just as a society come to understand not just how consequential our criminal justice system is to so many aspects of our law and culture and just how society functions, but there's a particular awareness, which has always been why I've loved teaching sentencing, that we can learn about a lot more than just the criminal justice system when we see how we make these choices, and particularly, how we treat what I would consider sort of marginalized populations, marginalized across a range of criteria, whether we're talking race or gender or sexual orientation or class or nationality, you name it. We just the realities of not just what I'd call structural inequality, but just sort of a system that functions in a way that means certain people are going to consistently get the short end of the stick, and other people are consistently going to take advantage of
Right.
of the way the system functions. And so, that's I've always thought the class was so valuable to bring those topics out, and more and more people see that, and I'll happily take more credit than I deserve at raising that awareness. But then, the next two pieces of this, and again, it's been just so central to my own career, is um, roughly when we finished the first edition of the Sentencing Law and Policy casebook. It was 2003, 2004, and it was pretty standard for the casebook publishers to say, well, we expect you all also to do a website as kind of a companion to the book. And we're like, okay, that makes sense. We'll sign the contract and says that. And around that time, I was starting to get really interested in blogs. And I was just reading a lot of blogs. And I actually had a former uh, co-clerk who was writing what I thought was a really interesting blog that was very sort of personal about his experience as a law professor and other things going on. And so I was just having the best time kind of following these blogs. And I said to my co-authors, instead of doing a traditional static website to support this book, why don't we develop a blog? That's kind of the hot thing. Won't that be cool? And all that. And one in particular, so like, yeah, does that sound like a good idea? Good luck with that, Doug. And I'm like, oh, I get it. You kind of don't want the blog thing because it's probably a lot of work and energy, and I kind of understand. And it seems to be something that I'm more passionate about than you others are. So I'll start working on it myself, and we'll see where that takes me. And then just by dumb luck of good timing, I got that blog up and running about a month before the Supreme Court decided, arguably the most important sentencing case, in recent Supreme Court history. And so my blog just blew up because I was sort of in the right place at the right time. And I had been thinking about these issues really deeply in conjunction with putting the casebook together and in conjunction with teaching this course about that, right? I was one of sort of the few people in the country that was even paying attention to this case so closely because I kind of understood it had all sorts of implications if it came out a certain way, and it came out that way, and my world kind of blew up in a really exciting way. But again, it's just I see these sort of wonderfully fortunate kind of professional dominoes that just kind of stacked and fell just the right way for me, and it's just been a big part of what's made, like you were saying, how can you do the same thing for 25 years? I think back, that was about 15 years ago. I'm like, wow, life was so different then,
Yeah.
different, technologically, different in terms of the issues that I was working on, and just it was so exciting because I can type something up that I'm thinking on the computer and hit publish, and like the whole world can see that, and I have a link that I can send to people. Like that was this big novel idea at
Yeah.
the time, and now it's just like, yeah, of course, right, whatever.
Yeah, no, it's cool though. You're at the forefront of that, and it seems to have paid off. And
Yeah.
um, yeah, so I'm curious. You went to Ohio State. You joined as a professor, and how did your role evolve over time? And when did the Drug Enforcement Policy Center start?
Yeah, it's good, a wonderful question. Thank you. As you get more comfortable with what you do as a law professor, you either get you often get restless in a variety of different possible ways. So one possible restlessness is, oh, I'll become more of an administrator, right? And often, you get dean's roles, and certainly you get asked to do all sorts of administrative stuff, and you can lean into that more when teaching is becoming kind of more predictable, or you don't have to spend as much time on it because you're familiar teaching the same course over and over again. or maybe you move on to a book project or something else that's a version of scholarship that has a different timeline and focal point. And I had a little bit of that from doing my casebook and other things. But what the blog had always made me kind of really drawn to were kind of the next cutting edge thing in the criminal justice space. And so, one, for example, that's actually timely again, as these things go, is right after the Supreme Court in 2008 first had its big ruling about the Second Amendment. That was a case called Heller, where they sort of first said there's a Second Amendment right. I said, I want to teach a class on that because that seems really interesting. And I could see all sorts of ways that if there are all these gun rights, it could impact our criminal justice system because, of course, there are a lot of people who get convicted for possessing guns or having guns involved in other activities. And so I, for a year, did a seminar on that and started writing a little bit about that on my blog. But I noticed, gosh, lots of other people are writing about that too, and they know more about the history of the Second Amendment, and they candidly seem to like guns more than I do. In fact, I took pride for a while until some students took me out skeet shooting that I thought I was the only person who was a specialist on gun rights and the Second Amendment that had never actually touched a gun. And then
Yeah.
they're like, "Well, yeah, you can't keep bragging about that. You're coming out skeet shooting with us." I'm like, "Okay," and I'm like, and of course it was fun. I'm like, "Oh, I get this. This is kind of fun." And so
Yeah.
I sort of see that angle now, which was useful. But and so then it was around that same time. It was 2010. That's when California had its full legalization initiative for marijuana, and this is in the wake of um, the Obama administration coming in saying they were going to end the medical marijuana raids, how unfair it was the federal government was trying to kind of unduly interfere with. We had the Gonzalez versus Raich case, which I had followed, somewhat back in 2005, sort of just looking at federal authority to go after people who were complying with state law. And I'm like, that's really interesting. And wow, if California passes the full legalization initiative in 2010, that's going to be huge. And I remember thinking at the time, like, I'm not sure it'll be super huge for criminal justice reasons, but it's huge enough, and it may be super huge for all sorts of other reasons. And then, as it actually failed, and I'm like, oh,
Yep.
all right, well, I've gotten kind of revved up thinking about that. Let's see what comes next. And then in 2012, we get the three states, and I remember particularly talking to students. I'm like, all right, one of these has to pass, and it's going to be a really big deal if we get legalization in a state, especially in the Obama years when I don't think the federal government will feel comfortable cracking down after they had already had the Ogden memo, and so this could be really huge. And then sure enough, Colorado and Washington get their initiatives passed, and everyone's like, well, now what? And I'm like, yeah, this is really interesting. And I was really struck at how even really smart people had no idea what the law and practice and policy was at this space, right? So, hey, it's still federally illegal. Aren't they fully preempted from having their own legal? No, that's not how it works. In fact, the Controlled Substances Act has, express non-preemption built into it. And, yes, there's tension, but it's very complicated. And the more I talk to other people about some of these federal and state policy issues, and especially, watched among other folks, Sam Kamen, who's a friend at the University of Denver, work on Colorado's regulatory scheme. I'm just like, there are so many interesting issues here in the cannabis space that I don't have any confidence that other than industry folks and other than the policy people already working in this area, that there's going to be a lot of additional legal knowledge brought to bear, right? And people would learn it and they'd understand it, but and I actually asked around and looked around, are there any other academics who are thinking about these issues, especially in the law school environment, and was struck that there really didn't seem to be, right? That I really felt as though this was an area that was way underdeveloped. There was obviously all the stigma that came with drug policy more generally. There was certainly a bunch of folks, among whom I was one, complaining about the war on drugs and the problems with the criminalization of drug use and drug activity. But to look at what's it like when we move from a prohibitionist regime to a semi-legal or legal regime, that's really rich and complicated, and nobody's there unpacking it without an agenda, right? And so I'm like,
Right.
this is interesting. I'm going to sort of really try to do more here. I got authority to teach a seminar. I taught the seminar, and the students were so engaged, and they helped me see 100 other issues that I hadn't even thought about. I'll candidly admit early on, like I didn't even fully understand 280E until about a year into I want to work in this space. Like, oh, they pay extra taxes too. Wow, what if
Yeah.
and on, right? And of course, the business people know that, but the business
Yeah.
people don't even know how to kind of engage that. And so I really do think it was the thrill of new issues, but that combined with feeling a unique obligation as an academic that I could come to these issues. Obviously, everybody has an agenda of sorts, but I could come with a kind of open-mindedness about just what's important here, and especially with a commitment to training the next generation of students, right?
Yeah.
Because I thought this is going to be an area valuable for students to know about when it comes to getting jobs, but even more critical that early in their career they learn about these topics in kind of a deep and rich way before they think about where they want to practice or how they want to practice or what's happening here. And so it really started with sort of this real excitement over cannabis reform. I'll throw one last piece in, especially as it relates to the criminal justice issues that we're also talking about. By like 2013, 2014, 2015, I was getting more and more pessimistic about the ability for the Obama administration to get broader criminal justice reform done. Right, he had done a few little things. We'd gotten crack sentencing reduction, but that was still half a loaf as well. And it seemed like, especially after the 2014 uh, election cycle, when Republicans took over control of both houses, that just nothing would get done in the criminal justice space. And I really felt like marijuana reform, cannabis reform had the potential to be disruptive to the war on drugs in a way that wasn't getting done elsewhere, even though there was sort of broad support. My colleague Michelle Alexander had written The New Jim Crow, and people were talking about it in a passionate and informed way, and yet it still wasn't getting us to a policy difference. And so that was really where my interest in cannabis reform, as it intersects with criminal justice reform, really kind of blossomed. And I wrote an article, kind of my first entry into that combination, about why expungements should be a central part of any cannabis reform effort, and what work there was still to do. And the early states didn't do much of this at all. That's grown wonderfully, and now no state will pass cannabis reform without including expungement, but that's still just an incomplete version of what needs to get done. And
Yeah.
so
I mean,
again,
I'll echo that. Like, getting into the cannabis space showed me the mess that the criminal justice system and the war on drugs had done on so many lives. And I also saw this crossover of cannabis reform and criminal justice. And as someone on the business side, it was frustrating to see business things moving, but without the reform on the sentencing side and on just the policy side.
yeah,
Um,
and I think there's still kind of a richness and a rich challenge to how those intersections play out, because I totally understand why people who are business people and want to be business people, it's not that they necessarily don't want to see criminal justice reform. They're just like, that's somebody else's job, and I'm just going to try to move my business forward. And I, especially think about businesses that have a social conscience, and maybe they're going to commit themselves to give some profits to organizations that specialize here. Maybe they're going to have a set of diversity statements or equity statements, so they're in good faith they want to be good corporate citizens in this space, but they say it's hard enough to get a business to function here, right? Without having to be thinking about that other stuff, which I think other people should be in charge of, or some version of that. And here's where I'm particularly driven in all the work that I do, but especially in the cannabis space, where I think it's where you got to build the infrastructure, and it's the policymakers, the lawmakers that have to create a structure for business where it's not, gee, let's hope the businesses do better. Let's incentivize the businesses to prioritize those sets of issues, so that you can move sort of good business sense and good social justice together, and not just sort of hope that will work out. But that's hard to do, and that's why I wrote
I mean, that's
my
something
first
I've been
article.
working on, trying to align incentives for these
Yeah,
businesses because I do feel that it's crucial if you're in the cannabis industry to engage in this and to try to get people out of jail that don't belong there for this plant. And so, yes,
and I would say,
I'm a
and
big proponent.
I'd love to get your comments on this as too. I mean, I say this to a variety of folks, and I do think in lots of ways the cannabis industry owes a significant debt, not just to the, like, oh, all these people were put in jail in the past, but realistically, it's because there's been a growing concern about the inequities of the drug war that I think you have marginal folks more willing to vote, whether it's an initiative or whether it's a legislative vote. You know, I see we did bad before and it's been racially unjust. And so I want to do better, right? That's helping to push the policy agenda. And I'll go even further and say, and because of prohibition, the price that quote unquote consumers have paid for cannabis has been inflated, obviously, because you got to deal with the illegality and all the inefficiencies that illegality creates. And that's itself why you now have a customer base that's actually willing to pay as much as they're willing to pay in the legal market because they've historically overpaid for what is essentially a weed, right? And
Yeah.
so, those realities for me is always what makes me a little preachy at times. Like, if the businesses don't understand how much they, in a sense, do owe a debt to the prohibition models that the modern
Yeah.
industry is necessarily built upon. Now, again, how much of a debt? What should they be doing
Sure.
to pay back? Those are challenging issues, but all of that motivated not only for me expungement's kind of a no-brainer and easy, and I'm eager to have that be as broad and robust as it possibly can be. But then it's what's next in the space, and for me, I'm a big fan of social equity and the concern about getting the industry to be more equitable, but I still will be a criminal justice reformer through and through. And while there are still, literally thousands of people incarcerated for trafficking cannabis, they're the ones not benefiting from expungement. They just need commutations or some other kind of remedy, resentencing, whatever it might be, including lots and lots of people who may be serving time for another offense, but the length of that sentence was influenced by the fact that they were involved in a cannabis offense in the past, right? There's the full footprint of cannabis prohibition as it cashes out through our criminal justice system has never been fully accounted for, and I don't think can ever be fully remedied. But that's where I think my specialty lies, is kind of looking at those intersections, right? And so this is really very much kind of the backstory that led to the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, because I said there's just so much to unpack here, and I want to particularly focus on that. How does cannabis reform and criminal justice reform, fit together, move over time? What are the relationships between cannabis reform and public safety? There's so much to look at, and it's all changing in real time. It's so hard to keep up with it day to day. And so I put in a proposal to the Charles Koch Foundation for, actually, it initially started as a research project in this space. And they said, well, we'd like to fund centers, not research projects. And, those are more permanent. And I'm like, you mean you'll give me more money? Okay, I'll think about that. Sure. Right. And so ended up working wonderfully with my dean here on putting together a full proposal to create a center. And to their absolute credit, my instinct was, well, let's make it the Marijuana Center or the Marijuana Research Center or something like that. And the folks at the Koch Foundation said, well, won't that be figured out in 10 years or so? I'm like, no, I don't think it'll be figured out ever. But I get what you're saying, which is the marijuana piece of
Broaden.
it's going to move in a certain way that maybe we should be looking at the war on drugs more generally. And
Yep.
so that's how we came up with the idea of having this focus be Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. The enforcement
The
piece,
name seems like you really hammered out on like what they were comfortable with, maybe.
yeah, there was a big part of that one, especially fundamentally. What the Koch Foundation was funding were criminal justice centers, right? Not
Right.
drug policy centers or even policy
But
centers.
it's drug enforcement, right?
Right.
So
Yes. Yeah. And I
yeah.
think that's the thought was, the hope was, with that part of the label, we emphasize that we're eager to start with the question of how are we criminalizing? Should we be criminalizing? What's the reality of criminal justice as it intersects with drug enforcement, and then the broader policy issues that attend to that, right? And it's raises this interesting point that as we've moved from cannabis to psychedelics, is it likely? Should it be likely that we completely move away from criminalization of any drug, or is fundamentally there always going to be enforcement? And of course, I emphasize this point all the time. There's a lot of alcohol enforcement. Sadly, we remember the Eric Gardner case where the New York City police, killed a guy who was selling loose tobacco cigarettes. That's tobacco enforcement, right? That if not if, inevitably, drugs are going to be regulated products. Regulated products, you have to enforce the regulations, even if it's legal. And so, in many ways, even though we sometimes take a narrow focus on, what do we mean when we talk about drug enforcement, fundamentally, drug policy comes with an implicit set of
Yeah.
enforcement agendas.
If
And
you're going to
so,
regulate things, you have to enforce the regulations
right.
100%. And yeah,
And I do think, I mean, this is, kind of at the crux of where I think cannabis policy is probably headed, if it's not already there, is, can we make that enforcement be a civil matter? Can it be like the way we enforce mostly securities law or other areas in which the expectation is, unless you're breaking the law, or you're really going way beyond what we expect responsible business people to be doing, if you get in trouble, it's not criminal justice trouble, it's, a fine or a sanction of some sort. And in so doing, we get rid of the
right.
stigma, and we make it easier for people who are struggling with drug issues
Yeah.
to get help, rather than be subject to a punitive system.
You're very much, singing a song that I sing. And um, I am a big proponent of removing criminalization as much as possible and giving people help that need it. I actually was talking to a friend that's in reentry this morning, and he lives here in Denver as well. And he was just saying how there's a really bad drug problem on the streets right now, but that just it isn't being here in Denver, and that it's just not being handled properly, and just the criminalization makes it impossible, and incentives are misaligned. He talked about a center that provides a certain type of drug alternative, opioid alternative, but you like have to be on it if you want to live in the center, and it's like
Right, right.
can't believe how misaligned some of these things are.
I mean, I think that misalignment problem is just so profound, and it cuts across so many issues. My sense is there are a fair number of treatment facilities and the like that oppose decriminalization because their bottom line depends on having people referred
Right.
into their center from the criminal justice system, right? And it's just like, well, okay, but and I get where they realistically say people won't come in on their own, but that's because we haven't made it easier for people to come in on their own. You're
Right.
sort of on the back end
We
where
got to
you're sort of
make the
like, oh,
lives better for
yeah,
everyone, not
exactly.
just their bottom line. That's like I preach it on probably every episode now, just that incentives are generally misaligned in so many areas of our society. And people that really care about humans and human rights need to try to align to get these things right, and to make it so that systems are in place to help people and create sustainable bottom lines. That's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where my optimism I was talking about earlier. I think not only is that possible, I actually think that's likely when we clear out, some of this sort of encrusted criminal justice approaches to things. It's not going to be perfect, right? That's the other thing that's
Of
important.
course,
I
yeah.
think that's been a challenge in the cannabis space at times is, you know, reformers for understandable reasons want to sort of preach a kumbaya future where it's like if we just get rid of criminalization, everything will be ideal. It's like, well, things will be better
Yeah.
and we can make it a lot better, but you got to be careful about, this sort of, you know, crime's going to drop 40% as long as we make it legal, or, it's just not realistic to expect anything to change that much that quickly, even though if we start moving in the right direction, we can rightfully be
Yeah.
hopeful that we're making progress.
Yeah, and then the reality of our society is that even if you tried to make a blanket change like that, that's just not how our brains work. Like
Yeah, yeah.
the actual reality of how that plays out isn't the rosy way that people would hope. But I agree, we're certainly making some progress, slower than we'd like for sure, but we're making it. So we've talked a lot about the criminal justice system and how drug policy has affected that. You know, I certainly emphasize in some of the talks that I have that what a big sort of weight this is on our modern incarceration system and criminal justice. Like, from you're in drug policy and you're a drug policy expert, from your perspective, like how much of a weight is this issue on the criminal justice system as a whole?
I think it's a huge burden, and I think the scope of the burden is underappreciated at times. I don't know if you followed this, but there's kind of an interesting debate among versions of nerds like me, like, oh, even if we ended the war on drugs, look, only, 20% of the people incarcerated are there for drug offenses. And so would that really put a dent in mass incarceration? And, look, the average drug sentence is only a year for this or that, and I think that um, fails to attend to how much drug criminalization and both the stigma and the consequences uh, of drug offenses and drug convictions just weigh on human potential, right? That ranging from you know, having had a student or two who obviously very capable. They're in a top ranked law school and doing incredible work, but oh, they admitted that they used cannabis, rightly so, on their bar form, and now they've got to spend time getting 6 letters saying they're not really addicted to drugs so they can sit for the bar, right? Beyond the that's
Oh
just
my god.
silly, circa 2022. That's just a
Right.
waste of human potential. He could be doing other things with that
Waste
time.
of time, waste of
And
effort. Like,
right, another student who driving cross country to come back to classes, gets pulled over in Iowa and then has to tell his faculty, I'm going to have to take a couple days off to go back to Iowa to get this thing resolved. Even though, and again, that it's that kind of stuff because this doesn't show up in people in prison. This doesn't show up um, even often in arrest statistics or other metrics that our criminal justice system tries to quantify, although not particularly well. This is just the various ways in which um, criminalization of this activity, and this is just a tiny piece of it, just reverberates through misallocated time, misspent potential, and that's obviously just minor relative to an individual headed to college who gets in trouble celebrating at a party and gets a drug conviction and then loses their student financial aid, and now their entire life course has changed
unnecessary
based on this.
burdens, yeah,
Yeah,
that
and
are
so
being created.
yeah, and they're not easily quantified, but they're easily identified. And I think, in fact, and this is another piece of it, I think there's another piece that's often part of it. And they become, because they're so stigmatized, we don't find out about them, right? So we don't
Mm,
have people who kind of are working at whatever job they may be working on that's not their full potential tell us, oh yeah, I kind of got stuck at this job because I have this really old conviction and I'm afraid to even apply to this other thing that maybe I could get, but I worry they would ask me about that. And of course, that's part of the problem. They don't want to tell
right.
anybody because there's that stigma that goes with that. Where one of the things I want to brag about is the work that our center has done in conjunction with Governor Mike DeWine's office to help people apply for pardons in the state of Ohio, and the backstories of so many of these individuals to be part of this program, they have to have had 10 full years after they completed their criminal sentence where they're being contributing members of the community, doing volunteer service. These are the winning stories of people who have had criminal justice involvement. And yet their stories are full with I got involved with drugs. This one bad thing happened. Then I was in a cycle of the criminal justice system.
Mhm.
Fortunately, I broke myself out, right? Not the system really did much to help me get out of that, but and time and time again, just seeing these small events for people on good tracks get derailed. And so it's just, I don't want to again overstate it. I could probably find a bunch of folks, outside on the street now where if they told us about their alcohol history or their struggle with, gambling addiction or whatever it might be, there are other things that are legal that
Sure.
disrupt people's life course. But I just think the ways in which the criminal justice system doesn't meet people where they are and help
Yeah.
people become the best version of themselves is
Mm,
almost by definition, if somebody's using drugs, especially if they're using it in a problematic way, they're struggling to find the best version of themselves. But to think in any way shape or form that the criminal justice system is going to help rather than
right.
hurt that progress.
I mean, what a better society that we'd be if the goal of the system was to help everyone reach their potential and to be what they can be. Um, it's yeah, I mean, it's really, I've seen just countless stories of just getting involved in the system from one little thing that can change the course of lives, as you're saying. So hopefully we're moving in that direction.
Yeah, I hope so
Yep.
too. And that's again, and I think it's an all hands on deck operation. And it's where I think encouraging everybody to do whatever little part they can is part of what's important.
And you talked about the challenge of quantifying some of these things, the challenge with data and metrics in the criminal justice system, especially around the war on drugs. What's your current take on that? And do some of the new organizations that are out there working on this excite you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm extremely excited. My sense is there's been a turn in the last couple of years, especially to sort of understand how important it is to have as good a data as possible. across a variety of metrics, whether it's incarceration, whether it's arrest rates, whether it's, being taken off probation and parole or community supervision and being remanded, these technical violations. There's where I think drugs play a huge part in our system that we underappreciate the extent to which
Mhm.
people get convicted. Many more people are actually on probation and community supervision that are actually incarcerated, but those persons are often heavily supervised. And if they use drugs, and this is where it can be particularly pernicious, if they use drugs, they don't know that they're necessarily going to be remanded and sent back into custody. They're completely at the sort of discretion of a probation officer or a judge in how to respond to that wrongdoing. And there's every reason to be fearful that a range of biases kind of shape that. Um, so we're getting better, but there's so much information that's not captured either in real time or with all the nuance that is sort of critically important to do any of this kind of work. Here's one of the things, again, as I started studying the marijuana space, you just don't even, you can't conceive that this is how kind of limited the data is until we start doing better. My understanding is in most jurisdictions before cannabis reform hit the scene, um, when there was a car accident and somebody died, they would test the driver for alcohol and drugs, but then they would report it as either alcohol or drugs. And we wouldn't know either. Sometimes they'd even leave out whether it was alcohol plus drugs, right? And folks should know that polydrug use is usually the most dangerous when it comes to operating
Yeah.
cars and other such things. But then it wouldn't get coded as which drug or which sets of drugs. It would just
Yeah.
go into the system as yes, they had drugs in their system. Okay, well, what does that mean, and how can we understand that relative to whether there were multiple drugs in their system?
And when
As
you
you
take
probably
cannabis into account, I mean, it can stay in your system for 30 days.
exactly
So
right, and so
they could have had it, weeks before,
right, right, and
in
there's
a
been
perfectly
active
safe environment.
right, and so trying to do better on that sort of thing. But then here's the flip of it, right? And this is the flip that even when you get cannabis reform, you get other kinds of data problems. My understanding is in jurisdiction, there's been efforts, and a bunch of researchers have tried to see if when people are on probation and parole, does their drug use potentially lead to other criminal activity, right? So trying to sort of keep track of and testing folks who are subject to supervision to the random drug tests, but not remanding them for that, only remanding them if they then do some other kind of criminal behavior. Apparently, in some jurisdictions, this was a report I heard a couple years ago, so it might have changed. Once cannabis became legal, they stopped including that in the testing. So again, the instinct is, well, we shouldn't test people for legal stuff. Well, it's like, yeah, but if alcohol is being used and that's what's
We still
leading
want the
people to commit
data.
crimes,
Yeah.
exactly. And there's been other settings in which there's been less funding for drug testing when people are initially arrested. And again, there's obviously a balance between how invasive we want to be in understanding the relationship between drug use and a variety of antisocial behaviors. But at the end of the day, we can't have too much data, at least for us,
Yeah.
research nerds who want to try to understand this stuff better. And then, of course, probably a lot better than I do. Even if we just had cannabis data, that data needs to be much richer, right? I find
Oh my
in looking at a
gosh.
lot
The
of the
system makes
study,
it difficult for us to even create the data. Like
right,
there's
right,
so many hurdles to research that are just being so slow to knock them
right.
down. Obviously there's some research going on, but to me it's like, what was the argument for ever not researching?
I
Like,
know. I know. I mean, the degree to which, I mean, it's funny because we've been getting better, but we still have a long way to go. I always love when at every level, like, well, what's your strongest argument for getting rid of cannabis on Schedule One? I'm like, so we can research this stuff, right? I mean, it's just so
yeah.
obviously there's so much to this plant. There's so much to not. And again, this goes to the heart of if I told you, I always love using alcohol as sort of the version of this that somebody had a 12-ounce glass of alcohol and then they drove in a car. Well, wait a minute. If it was beer, I'm not worried that much at all. If it was whiskey, I'm getting out of his way, right? And, to say they used cannabis, oh, well, what's the THC level? How much? How frequent? On and on and on. And yet
Right.
that granularity seems to be not impossible to capture, but is where we're just getting started. And then, of course, and this is the part that's even more frustrating, at least for us crime nerds. Then we have different approaches in different states. I mean, I have a hard enough time And I think we collectively, you know, how many medical marijuana states are there? Like, does that count as a medical marijuana state with that program, right?
Right.
If you
Yep.
think it's hard to just, that's the basic law. What's the data on, what does medical marijuana mean in that state versus this other state? What does full legalization mean? How many ounces can you have? What can you purchase? It's in a nation with 50 very different states and realistically very different parts in very different states, right? So, Columbus, Ohio, very different than Denver, Colorado, very different even than Cincinnati, Ohio. There's so much that we need to do better at, and yet
Yeah.
at the same time, there's reasons to be worried that even if you have more and more data, an ability to be confident about what that data tells us is ever still going to be challenging. And so I can understand why, there isn't more investment in data, even though there needs to be. And it's another piece of what I think is ongoing for all of us working in this space is doing the best we can to clarify and identify, okay, which pieces of the data are the most important. And I will
Yeah.
say, and this is the part that's sort of weirdly clarifying about the business community, is they understand that, right? It's like, let's figure out the consumers, let's figure out the price to produce, and let's figure out, how we can run a successful business. And my sense is that there's not great but better data on the industry side than there is on kind of the social
Yeah.
science side, because it's not just they have the money to do it, but it's easier for them to solidify what's important for the work that they do. And in the criminal
Right.
justice space and the drug policy space more generally, we still struggle to figure out, what is the most important data and how can we
And what
process it.
can we do? What are we
Right.
going to be allowed to do?
Right.
It's
Right.
a
Well, sure.
combination
Yep.
of those things. It's like the business side, like they can substantiate the spend because they're seeing it returned to them on the back end. And, they can do things within their sort of column. But the researchers, there's just so much ambiguity in terms of what's actually going to be allowed to do. And, I know researchers that have been like Dr. Sue Sisley that have been working for, 20 plus years and she finally got a federal license for to grow cannabis, but it was only in one place for so long. And
Yep. Yep.
anyway, sounds like we're preaching the same thing. Just that more research is certainly a plus. Obviously there's the right data versus too much data, but we're starting to make some steps in that direction.
Yeah, I definitely think we're getting there. And here's where I'll do a shout out to our funders, the Charles Koch Foundation, the Menard family, because the resources they provided our center enables us to think about these things again, distinct from, oh gosh, we got to sell a product, or oh, there's a government report that's due on this date, or because somebody else has put a mandate behind us. That's the joy of being in an academic setting, is we can sort of take the time, research, reflect, talk to stakeholders, and what are the important issues that we can move forward. And I will say, the more we do this kind of independent research, the more I just realize we need a lot more people doing a lot more stuff, because there's so
Yeah.
many dynamic questions that we're only starting to scratch the surface on.
Yeah. Agree 100% and really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. I mean, it's clear in our conversation how impactful it's been. And, I know you started off your sort of first baby at Ohio State was the sentencing class. Where are things now in general around sentencing reform, around mandatory minimums? How are you feeling about that?
Candidly, not great. I would say not great, largely because things had gotten so much better over a number of years that we talked a little bit before about so much more awareness, mass incarceration, the various racial and social injustices that are sort of coursing through our criminal justice system. Again, I think marijuana reform is itself a byproduct of that, of more and more people understanding that we need to criminalize less, and especially in settings where we've done so inequitably. But the rise in crime that we've seen, particularly homicides and other sort of high profile concerns about rising crime rates, I think has emboldened what I would sort of consider to be the sort of the tough on crime sentiments to sort of come back and kind of flex their muscles because they think they have the public support behind them, and lots of criminal justice nerds are spending way too much time looking at this one prosecutor election or that one
Mhm.
state initiative. I think it's a bigger, broader set of trends, but I think it's something that a number of us have always said, which is when crime is tracking down, or really it's the perception of crime is tracking down, that's the time, that's the opportunity to move forward aggressively with criminal justice reform. When crime is tracking up, you almost sort of got to try to hold on to your gains, right? It's maybe I'm almost imagining sort of a stock market. You got to bull market go, and you got to take advantage of it. That's crime going down. That's the
Right.
chance to make reform. I will say though, and this is where again I sort of like returning to the marijuana conversation. I don't see the marijuana reform movement slowing down much, if at all, notwithstanding concerns about broader crime. And that's to me, a reminder that this is a space that is viewed differently, viewed as just like kind of a wasted criminalization. I think that's largely because almost everybody knows people or
Right.
themselves are involved in cannabis activity, and they just see it as so silly to make it the subject of criminalization. But we've I felt more optimistic a few years ago that we were going to have some broader criminal justice reforms. Some might say, hey, we got the First Step Act in 2018. We had, a Trump administration supportive of criminal justice reform, a Republican Congress supportive of criminal justice reform. And so a lot's been achieved. But definitely when crime is going up and when concerns about crime are going up, we can expect, and I think, need to be fearful about more mandatory minimums, more punitive legislation, if just for show, right? I just saw last week, again, building off of the horrible mass shootings and the concern about gun crime. Somebody suggested a 5-year mandatory minimum for any felon in possession of a gun, and that's just crazy because
Yeah, it's crazy.
threatening somebody for 5 years for that makes no sense, and especially makes no sense because there are a lot of people who are felons who have not done anything violent. They've done a drug crime.
Right.
They've got a record that way, and so I think punitiveness is at risk of being on the rise. But I think we're
Yeah.
collectively at a place where smarter criminal justice reform is not only possible but can have bipartisan support. But we need people who are continuing to sort of find the right avenues that's sensitive to the sort of the popular feeling of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good perspective on it. I mean, I think we're in a time right now where we'll see how everything that's going on affects this and how it changes mindsets, and hopefully we'll continue to combat a lot of the stigma around the criminal justice system and people being involved in it.
Yep, I'm hoping, and again, it's the particular irony of the more people who know people who have been involved, the more likely they're going to be understanding that
Yep.
these are all individuals who've come in contact for a range of reasons. And so I always
Yep.
thought the system couldn't grow punitive forever because it had a natural sort of pendulum back, and I think we've seen some of that, but where it's headed, we'll see.
Yeah. So, a lot of the things that you've mentioned, I've seen directly, in the conversation that you've helped tons of people along the way, whether that be students, whether that be people that have been in the system. And it's awesome. Are there any stories aside from what you've already shared that really stand out as like, I saw how much my work affected this person?
I really appreciate that. I would say it's a kind of an easy answer because I've been working on my blog for, gosh, going on 18 years now. But that work where I've gotten emails, from the very beginning, all through its entire existence, from particularly family members of persons going through the system for whom the system is just so impenetrable, right? That just seems, the lawyer doesn't have time to talk to the family member. The prosecutor doesn't want to engage with, the family of the person subject to uh, sentencing or whatever stage of the criminal justice process they're in. And so just to get notes from family members saying, thank you so much for your resource. I learned about this. It's also can be heartbreaking because often they're asking like, what can I do to help my family member at this stage of sentencing? What more is out there to help me understand just what this criminal justice system is like? And that's really where I do think it has reinforced my sense that the data is incomplete because you read about a person sent to prison, you read about a person arrested, you read about a person you know subject to being sent back to prison because they got a dirty urine while on supervision. Well, that person has a web of individuals who care about them, and who aren't counted in any formal way but whose lives are impacted and whose vision, both of their loved one's life and their own life is
Yeah.
necessarily reshaped by those criminal justice encounters. And
I mean,
so,
think of all the children, especially of the
yeah,
people
of
in the
course,
system.
absolutely. And so to kind of, I guess I'm proudest that the work that I've done on the blog has helped some of those individuals, but I'm also sort of proud I've created a mechanism that necessarily leads me to not lose sight of the humanity that this
Yeah.
system, uh, in many ways, sort of chews up and spits out. Even though I've been fortunate not to directly encounter that, and so that's and again, I think that's something that unfortunately for academics, we are expected to, and it's useful that we are writing kind of long ponderous research and are really trying to speak to an audience of 10 other super specialists to kind of refine our understanding of this issue or that issue. But I think that can sometimes distance us, kind of
Right.
from the day-to-day realities, and that's where, again, some of the service work that we've done and other things at the center has been another dimension of keeping in mind that not only do we have a unique opportunity to, but I think a fundamental obligation to the communities in which a law school is situated to help people's relationship to the law, you might say, be as good as it can be.
Yeah. So, you've been on the path of helping people for a long time, and I'm curious, was there anything that you remember from childhood that really showed you the importance of giving back?
I definitely think hearing about the 7 levels of tzedakah, and I may even have the kind of the levels all wrong, and I'm showing my Jewish roots here through and through, but getting an accounting, I think I probably heard it from my grandfather, who himself had was fortunate to do quite well as a lawyer and had given a lot of money to Hebrew University and a number of other institutions, and just this sort of idea that it's not just that you give back; it's that the way you give back itself kind of defines the richness and the significance of that kind of giving back. And my understanding was always, the highest level of charity was when you didn't know who was getting it, so you couldn't kind of enjoy seeing somebody get that, and they didn't know they were getting it from you, so you couldn't get any credit for it. But it was the pure act of of giving and knowing that somebody else was receiving, who was in need. That's what not only you should aspire toward, but should find a way to get satisfaction in that in and of itself, apart from what we always hope is the value that a gift provides. And so I think I certainly like getting credit for things that I do. It's an important aspect of my job, is that people know if I write something that's coming from me, and that so I don't want to overstate the extent to which I'm always aspiring to that seventh level of tzedakah, but I do think that kind of um, understanding that not all giving is the same, or that there's a again, this idea of sort of a richness or a depth to how you give and what it means, that I still remember it, and it still means a lot to me, and it still is where, in a kind of, guess, a funny way, I sometimes hope, especially when I blog, that that's providing to somebody in a way that I'll never hear about, but that doesn't mean it's not meaningful. In fact, maybe it's more meaningful that somebody has taken an article I've written, or has looked at a post that I've done, or even listened to a podcast and gotten meaning from it that I'll never find out about, but that's part of giving back.
Exactly. I mean, I was raised on similar values, and uh, you know, possibly by by similar types of people, and I can certainly relate to that, and um, I can appreciate it for sure. And yeah, and if at this point, if you'd like to ask me a question, you're welcome to.
I would. I'm excited to do so. Um, what are we not talking about that much? And you can pick any arena you want, but maybe drug policy is the one to start uh, now. That you think we'll be talking a lot more about 5 years from now? And I guess I'll give my answer, which is I think the right answer 5 years ago would probably have been psychedelics, right? I when I
Right.
started the center, and I was like, I guess I had heard of it, but I didn't, and now I'm, among other things, our center's co-sponsoring an event here at Ohio State. I find both the medicine and the policy issues really, really interesting, and it does seem like something that wasn't talked about much at all 5 years ago, and now a lot of people
Yeah.
are talking about it. You got anything else that fits that mold?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I definitely agree on psychedelics, and I think they'll become even bigger part of the conversation around drug policy and around health and healthcare. But One thing in particular is I think that we're going to start taking more ownership of our healthcare and our healthcare data. And I think that's really going to start to impact our lives more. And, integrating things like psychedelics and cannabis along with that, I think is going to be a big part of that. And I think as we evolve and learn new things, there has been a lot of research on increasing lifespan and just helping have more individualized care. And I think the data that we're accumulating now is going to lead to that. And hopefully that will lead to some positive change in the medical system.
Great. Yeah, that sounds terrific, and I hope you're right too. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm lucky to have good healthcare here, but I can just see. I mean, I've even seen, as I now have an app that keeps track of my doctor's appointments and everything's going along those ways, that the technology is moving us forward. But yeah, I like thinking about, how data what you sort of say about sort of individualized care could come to the
Yeah.
forefront.
Especially with like the AI and machine learning advancements that we're having, and then you take into account individual data that we've accumulated and that probably hasn't been put to great use yet. I think there's a lot going on there.
Cool, cool. All right.
So, the big question I ask everybody: if you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be, and how do you think that change would reverberate? And I'll preface with, like, you could very easily say like drug complete decriminalization or whatever. So certainly you're welcome to go that route, but no one will hold it against you if you go a different one.
Yeah, so I mean, that would be good, and that we could talk that through these days, especially, and it's frustrating to me, but it's in part because it's what's frustrating to me that I'm going to say it is I wish I could snap my fingers and have everybody who currently now seems to assume that arguments made in opposition are being done in bad faith instead view them in good faith, right? It's
Yeah.
just I'm finding it just so aggravating, not just, oh, that's somebody from the other tribe, and so they must be saying it for this reason or that reason, or this is what's wrong with them, or that's what's wrong with them. But even the degree to which, I find, and I think this has always been the case, but I think it's gotten so much worse now, that people aren't actually independently thinking about things. They're instead like, well, what do the people I dislike think about that? Oh, okay, then I must
Right.
hold the opposite view, right? I haven't really thought this through, and I haven't really, come to my own really sensible opinion about this, but I see the other team is for that, so I'm going to be against it, and vice versa. And I think if we could somehow just sort of, maybe this is the place for psychedelics, right? Sort of scramble people's kind of
Yes.
disaffinity for the other as the other, right? And again, this gets to my own. I'm not sure I'm that humble, but what I think is a certain degree of humility that I bring to, kind of ideas, which is I really don't think I have this all figured out. And because I don't have it all figured out, I not only want to hear what somebody else has to say, I kind of want to work hard to try to understand what's the really sensible foundation from which those ideas come from so I can really try to sort of thicken my
Yep.
understanding of other perspectives. And I just feel like so few people approach
Mm.
conversations with that, and I think it's part of why we have so much political division these days, but it's also, I sense that very few people are getting rewarded for being open-minded, right? So it's not just, oh, everyone's become so closed-minded and oppositional and partisan. It's that, again, we were sort of talking about incentives and misaligned priorities, right? There's very few people who think it's a priority to kind of approach things that way. And in fact, you get a sense, especially on the political side, that if people try that approach, they'll necessarily be assailed. Oh, why are you making league with those folks? There must be something wrong with you that you're even open to having a conversation about this or that, right? And
Right.
so, and again, this is the classic on both sides, right? I mean, I really do think
Right.
both of the traditional tribes and a lot of other mini tribes, fall prey to this in ways that I really wish I could change with the snap of my finger, and I think it would have incredible reverberations for our political and social discourse.
Absolutely. I mean, that's certainly something that's come up a fair number of times in this question. Is just the divisiveness in our society, the unwillingness to have open dialogue and discussion, and the immediate "I'm right, you're wrong." because of what team you're on. That's certainly a big problem in society, and one that unfortunately seems to be trending in the wrong direction right now. Like you mentioned, I tend to sometimes bring up in this answer as well that psychedelics could be part of that. They have been shown to increase empathy. I don't have it in front of me to cite. I can potentially link it in the notes, but I just saw a study come out that cannabis consumers are generally more empathetic. So just little things like that, hopefully will go a long way.
Well, and again, I think this is, and I think drug policy has the opportunity to highlight this in a different kind of way. I think because we've stigmatized drug use so much, because we've stigmatized in some respects, I don't want to say having fun, right? We still like to have fun as a society and do all sorts of fun things together. But I think we've reduced the number of sort of social spaces in which people just get to be, their non-political selves, right, and non-tribal selves, right. And even you think about sports, and I know you're a big sports fan, I'm a big sports fan, but that kind of plays into our tribalism to some degree. Now it still can be fun and binding in all sorts of ways, and I think it often is. But and I'm not pitching drug use for this reason alone, but that I do think you know the history of drug use is often built around certain kinds of social connections, and certainly my sense of people who reflect most fondly on drug experiences, it's that sociability that's driving that more than anything else. It's that desire for connection that a lot of people, whether it's alcohol, whether it's going outside to smoke during a smoking break, right? I mean, it's not just illicit substances; it's a range of ways in which consumption, maybe that's the right way to say it, right? Consumption is often fundamental to allowing us to kind of just relax and be with fellow human beings. And something that demonizes a certain form of consumption is not helping the cause, no matter how you
Yep,
slice it.
exactly. Well, I appreciate that. I generally appreciate the perspectives that you shared here, and the amazing work that you're doing. Um, especially specifically with the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. Um, how can people listening support you and your impact?
They should feel free to send me an email. Definitely go to the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center's website. Attend our events and just sort of be a part of our community. I think especially important, and thinking about what may be a very diverse audience that you have. Just letting us know about what issues that we're working on, or could be working on, that you think would be important. We're trying in our own way to kind of constantly be in touch with stakeholders, hear from different folks, whether it's industry players in the cannabis or psychedelic space, whether it's law enforcement, policymakers of all sort. We want to know the kinds of questions and issues that we can chase down using our resources and our independence, that will be useful for advancing the work that others are doing. And as I sort of said earlier, there's just so many topics that we could spend time on that I'd find interesting, that I think would be valuable. But I think, are at our best when we're working with folks in this community, however defined, to hear what's important to their work, and that we can integrate that into the projects that we're doing and we're thinking about. And so I think what's most helpful is not just see some of the work that we've done and download our papers and let us know if that's useful to you, but definitely send us emails. Let me know, boy, I'd love to hear about this, I'd love to do that. We recently did a tax paper about the revenue that tax revenue that cannabis legalization might provide here in Ohio, and it was just, when we first got the inquiry, I'm like, "Oh, this will be easy for us to do." And then we sat around and like mapped out all the different contingencies and suppositions that would be part of that. And that was just an incredible learning experience for me to sort of realize that when other people are citing, existing tax revenue or projected tax revenue, they've got a bunch of stuff built into their models that I hadn't thought about until we sat down and tried to produce our own model, right? And so, that's where uh, hearing suggestions and getting started with projects that we know will be useful because they've come from someone in our community that says that they're working on these topics, not only is valuable, so we make sure we're staying relevant, but helps us deepen and enrich our own understanding of the variety of ways to look at these important issues.
Absolutely. Well, I hope the listeners will take you up on that and utilize some of those resources and reach out. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure. I'm excited to get some more about these topics out there and hopefully get some other conversations going.
No, thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate you creating this forum. I've enjoyed listening to a lot of your other guests as well. Some folks I know that you're real excited that you've talked to, and I'm just so grateful for your help in getting these ideas out there, and also for helping us thinking about. We're thinking about doing our own podcast with the center. We're starting to make some progress on that, and that's great. And this great experience reinforces my sense of just how enjoyable that can be.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, happy to help if I can along the way, and we'll talk soon.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of People Are the Answer. To find out more, go to peoplearetheanswer.com.